So, as I said, so the last session was about generative AI, and this session will more be on the ethical side of AI and the way we can use it, not only in higher education, but in research at large. In this idea, what we want to explore today is the way we use and develop AI systems and models for digital humanities and digital scholarship. To do so, to have this exploration, we will welcome today David Berry, who is a professor of digital humanities at the University of Sussex, who will talk first about the more digital humanities perspective on the matter. And then we will listen to Giada Pistilli, who is an AI ethicist at Paris Sorbonne University and also at Hugging Face. The format of today's session will be 2 slots of 45 minutes for each presentation, Q&A included. So each presentation will be 35 minutes. And then we will end by a general discussion, if time allows, of what the different perspectives can bring into the practices of AI in digital humanities. So before giving the floor to David, I will briefly introduce him. So David is, as I said, the professor of digital humanities at the University of Sussex. There he has founded and designed the Sussex Humanity Labs. He was a visiting professor in many different universities, and I believe he's in Oxford today. And more specifically, we invited him to talk today regarding his work on the ethics and the ethical side, of AI in the digital humanities, and especially what caught my eyes in the first place was this chapter in the Bloomsbury Handbook of the Digital Humanities. So, David, the floor is yours for about 30 to 35 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk. Before I start, I just want to apologise for not having slides, but I've been rather sick the past few days, so I've had absolutely no time to prepare any. And also, I hope that my talk's not too disconnected, as I still have a little bit of the fever that I've been suffering from. So I hope you enjoy the talk. In this talk, I'm going to look at the emergent issues around digital humanities research in terms of automation and augmentation of humanities work, and really try to sort of surface some of the ethical issues that we should be thinking about and looking to. The literature concerned with ethics related to the digital is understandably huge and growing. And of course, I can only provide a brief, really summary of the key issues for consideration in 30 minutes. So in this talk, I will be focusing on the specific issues related to ethics and ethical practices within digital humanities, and I hope that questions of digital scholarship and related to notions of digital tools and archives can be something we can perhaps bring much more forward in the questions if people are interested. But the key question really is, what ought to be the principles or normative frameworks for guiding decisions in digital humanities projects, research units, and of course by individuals involved in digital humanities work. Now, within the digital humanities, there are different ways of thinking about the ethics of how a project might be developed, and indeed the practices of digital humanists themselves. And it's quite interesting, I think, that these have only recently been foregrounded. The digital humanities has not really created a lot of literature on ethical issues, which is in contrast to, for example, digital media or internet research and other related fields like new media studies. So it's kind of interesting that ethics has come a little bit late to the digital humanities. And I think this means there are some important debates to be had in digital humanities about what it means to be ethical, what is ethical practice in relation to some of the ways of working that have been developed. Now, I should just say that part of the reason for that is I think that digital humanists tend to identify with their home discipline, whether that be English literature, history, or what have you. And of course, they inherit the professional codes of conduct and standards that a particular disciplinary formation would have. But that has meant that, you know, for digital humanities writ large, and certainly for people coming through into digital humanities as a sort of more developed field, there is a sort of interesting absence there. Now, there have been some more recent questions raised about the digital humanities, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. And these often are kind of formulated in relation to what we might call the ethos of the digital humanities and its self-proclaimed virtues in scare quotes. And these are often outlined as things like collaboration, humility, and openness. The digital humanities has historically had a tendency to self-narrate through a kind of putative set of moral values rather than its specific methodological or epistemological commitments. So my aim today, anyway, is to think about how ethics is seen in practice in relation to the digital humanities, but also to connect them to this growing new area of artificial intelligence, which is beginning to be used more and more in the digital humanities themselves. Now, as I said before, there has been a considerable amount of work on ethics in, for example, digital media and internet studies. And of course, many of those themselves draw on work that's been done in sociology previously, psychology, and computer science as well, of course. Now, when thinking about ethics more broadly, it is common for us to think about at least three main approaches to ethics, so namely deontological, consequentialist, or virtue ethics. If I just run through those briefly, deontological approaches tend to bring forward the idea that choices cannot be made on the basis of their result, i.e. not consequential. Rather, the decision has to be made in conformity with moral norms or duties. This means that deontological approaches often are constructed in terms of maxims or principles that should be followed in compliance with the highest ethical principle, the Kantian categorical imperative. This creates a sense of shared rules and obligations, perhaps professional guidelines, that also allow others to essentially hold people to account who break these principles, these professional codes. And a good example of this, I think, is the Association of Internet Researchers Ethics Guidelines, which themselves were, there's quite interesting online discussion group of the development of those ethical principles. So it's quite interesting also to look at how those principles were developed over a period of time. Now, in contrast, consequentialist approaches hold that ethics should be assessed in relation to the consequences that actions bring about. One ought to choose that course of action which maximizes utility compared to the alternatives. The more likely the actions that maximize the likelihood that a given end is realized, that is, that the moral definition of a good is achieved, the more right the decision. And finally, virtue ethics emphasizes the virtues, in scare quotes, of course, or moral character of the actor. So virtues and vices tend to be the key categories used to assess ethical action. And virtue itself in this formation is understood as a matter of degree. So in this case, the virtuous person possesses a general intellectual capacity, practical wisdom, and this enables them to identify the morally relevant features in every situation and determine the right course of action. Now, just also to note, due to limitations on time, I've not been able to include discussions around information ethics. There's some useful work. Floridi obviously is an important name there, and Doyle made some very interesting critiques of information ethics. I also am not going to talk about the area of contractarianism and ethics, particularly in terms of social contract philosophy. The idea essentially that ethics is a form of a social compact or mutual agreement. And although an ethics of care is an important way of conceptualizing ethics in relation to particularly feminist thought, within the digital humanities, this has only been a much more recent development in terms about thinking about ethics. And indeed, drawing on Held, for example, the idea that an ethics of care builds relations of care and concern and mutual responsiveness to need on both the personal and wider social levels. Within social relations in which we care enough about one another to form a social entity, we may agree on various ways to deal with one another. This is something that has been connected to digital and data ethics more generally, and a good example of this is D'Ignazio and Klein's recent work on data feminism, which I can mark here, but unfortunately I can't go into in further detail. So as such, much of the existing literature on ethics and digital humanities has tended to prioritize either the deontological or consequentialist approaches, raising questions, particularly in relation to the digital. So, for example, in the case of data bias, one of the key ways in which ethics tends to be thought about in relation to the digital is to locate it within the context of computational inequities or computational power. Injustice, for example, might be strongly linked to problems with the data, which many people have argued might be addressed by better data, more data, or democratizing data sources. This might raise also deontological issues of how we prevent, for example, artificial intelligence systems to use people as sources of data or to manipulate them, or alternatively to focus on the perceived consequences of particular machine learning systems and the possible harms they might cause. There's also an interesting question about the relationship between open access and ethics, which I just want to again highlight, which again I don't have much time to talk about, but that will be interesting also perhaps in the questions, particularly in relation to requirements and increasing requirements that academic work is published open access, the implications of that for academic freedom and for the freedom to publish. So I think that's quite an interesting question in relation to ethical practices in the digital humanities. So within the digital humanities field, then, the thinking about the idea of a set of ethical principles that might serve as a professional guide to action has been discussed, but as yet no specific digital humanities guidance has been drawn up. There have been some interesting attempts to sort of sketch this out, but there's no kind of final document, and partly that is perhaps the lack of kind of strong disciplinary identity, but also the lack of strong national organisation or membership organisations, something that's been discussed in the UK in particular. And considering the breadth and depth of digital humanities work that has been undertaken over the last 20 years, it's noticeable that ethics has been under-theorised within the digital humanities itself to a remarkable extent. Now, when one wishes to undertake a digital humanities research project, it's interesting, I think, that there is no straightforward set of guidance or guidelines that one can point towards. And this is a serious lack if one wants to think about ethical concerns. For example, Lennon has a very thoughtful discussion about digital humanities and the ethics of funding. Of course, lots of question marks over soft money funding for the digital humanities, private funding, philanthropy funding, and so on and so forth, donor funding. And the implications of this are very, very thinly considered, actually, in relation to the digital humanities. Instead, actually, most ways of thinking about ethics in the digital humanities historically have tended towards a form of virtue ethics, actually, which is really rather interesting, particularly in terms of the kind of characters that digital humanists are thought to have, such as being, and this is a quote, nice, collegial people, egalitarian people, non-hierarchical people, and able to work well with others. Now, whilst virtue ethics, and of course this is a very self-flattering picture of themselves, which I think is very interesting, whilst virtue ethics offers some means for thinking through these questions of ethics and the challenging problems that arise in undertaking digital humanities work, virtue ethics itself tends to articulate these questions in terms of arretaic concepts, that is, in terms of virtues and vices, or axiological concepts, so in terms of better or worse or good or bad, rather than deontological notions such as right, wrong, action, duty, or obligation. Arretaic concepts, of course, are concerned with arete, the notion of excellence or virtue, phronesis, practical or moral wisdom, and of course eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness or human flourishing. Whereas axiological concepts are usually described as being concerned with value, particularly intrinsic and extrinsic value, based on comparative analysis of, for example, which activity is better or worse than another. It's got a comparative dimension to it. Whereas deontological concepts are much more concerned with the kind of moral laws or moral rules or professional codes of conduct or practice, particularly in terms of duty and obligations. And of course, the name of Immanuel Kant is always associated with these notions of deontological theorizations of ethics. Now, this emphasis on the goodwill, as it were, of the individual researcher in digital humanities places responsibility on the good character of the researcher to do the virtuous thing, but it's less clear on the professional expression of that requirement. Now, virtue ethics tends to derive from Christian notions of this idea of goodwill, and the reliance on virtue ethics within digital humanities is interesting in relation to its early historical links to biblical and theological scholarship, particularly philology and textual criticism. Early digital humanists, such as Father Roberto Busa, an Italian Jesuit who studied Thomas Aquinas' texts, was extremely influential on the early use of computers in humanities work. He was working in the 1940s. And this connection perhaps raises suggestive questions about an under-theorized Christian ethical foundation to the discipline of digital humanities. It's notable, of course, that Aquinas has also been a very influential thinker on the development of some virtues of virtue ethics, and of course, through Busa, therefore, on digital humanities. But nonetheless, this lack of formalized standards of good practice are noticeable considering the close relationship that digital humanities scholars have with digital archives. And archivists tend to be very aware of many of the questions that are related in relation to, for example, decolonization, gender, race, class, and sexuality, not just in terms of sexuality, but also in terms of the assumed categories inherited or transferred or remediated from physical archive practices, or even just in terms of born digital data that's scraped from the internet. And also, considering that computer ethics itself has been thinking about the questions of how computer technology should be used since at least the 1960s, and as Moore argues, a central task of such an ethics should be to formulate policies to guide our actions, the lack of guidelines in digital humanities is very interesting, and the kind of reliance on this sort of virtue ethics framework is rather strange, to say the least. Now, with the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's inevitable that they become a focus of new methods within the digital humanities, but also they raise new questions of practice and, of course, new questions of ethics. Across a range of disciplines, the impact of the automation of methods of analysis that AI has promised and to some extent has delivered has raised specific challenges in each field in terms of implementation and methodological reflection. However, even as they raise questions of biases and errors, there's also a more fundamental obscurity problem that is raised by the particularly explanatory deficit in relation to the difficulty of understanding what it is that an AI is doing when it classifies and analyzes the underlying research. Data, that is. In this case, not only is it a case of digital humanities acting ethically, but also how can we be sure that the systems and tools that we use act ethically and even legally? And of course, I'm gesturing here to the question of the proprietary nature of many of the larger LLM systems like ChatGPT that have been used extensively in experimentations around digital humanities work. Now, the digital humanities are themselves very much influenced by technical developments and achievements of the computing fields. And in fact, they have a kind of close relationship between them and are often guilty, I think, of seeking to rush new approaches into their digital tools and archives. And this notion of augmenting the abilities of digital humanists through computer technology owes a lot to claims that arise as far back as 1981 in relation to computing. So, for example, Steve Jobs famously called computers bicycles for the mind, implying that they augmented the cognitive capacities of the user, making them sharper, faster, and more knowledgeable. Indeed, Jobs argued that when humans created the bicycle, they created a tool that amplified an inherent ability. The Apple personal computer is a 21st century bicycle, if you will, because it's a tool that can amplify a certain part of our inherent intelligence. It can distribute intelligence to where it's needed. And actually, that is very interesting when you think about the way in which digital humanities often articulates itself. This notion, as it were, of augmenting human intellect, drawing on notions of man-computer symbiosis, for example, from Doug Engelbart and Vannevar Bush. So these are particularly technical understandings of what it is that these technologies can do. But of course, without a set of ethical principles and guidance, there is a difficulty of, how one actually draws lines where one shouldn't go beyond, right? So that in a sense, and you actually see this, I think, in digital humanities practice, where there's a rush to implement whatever new technology is the shiniest moment. And of course, LLMs are a good example of this. So this notion of augmentation as at least a kind of background presupposition in the way in which people think about the kind of work that digital tools have offered in the digital humanities has generally taken the form of thinking about methods of performing, for example, text analysis, different forms of calculation, particularly of large corporeal data sets. And augmentation, you can see, was thought to extend the human capacity to work with humanities and culture. But actually under-theorized, I think, to a certain extent, was the notion of automation, that there could be actually the replacement of the humanities researcher, and the underlying problematics for the humanities more generally of as it were, a subjectless humanities research tradition. And I think both augmentation and automation raise different ethical questions, which really need to be thought about. So much of the earlier work that does discuss these kind of questions of automation and augmentation therefore has tended to assume a rather basic notion of automation, an idea really that allows the humanist to work with these larger data sets. And these were basically algorithms that could help sort, list, or classify in simple ways, particularly through the application of statistical analysis. So, for example, of course, Willard McCarty talks about the methodological commons that digital humanities shared. And he listed, for example, database design, numerical analysis, imaging, text analysis, and music retrieval and analysis. And he offered a kind of high-level division of digital humanities labor in relation to this, working on algorithmic or mechanical data analysis, metalinguistic, particularly the encoding projects, for example, TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, and other markup languages, and representation issues around essentially different aspects of the representation of data, the visualization of data, if you like. We might therefore think of the automation of the humanities as moving through a number of phases. The first involved bespoke software, often performed by a humanist coder to solve a particular problem. The second was the generalization of these early software tools into packages, which provide a one-stop shop, which involved little or no program requirement. And a good example of this, if you're not familiar with it, is Viant Tools, which is available on the internet, very simple, straightforward to use. And in the latest phase, we see the beginning, I think, of a much more sophisticated level of computational analysis using new machine learning tools. Again, at the moment, through a requirement of a certain amount of technical ability. So we've got this notion of humanist coders again, who to some extent are required to kind of customize the machine learning software. And a good example of this is Mallet, the machine learning for language toolkit software. But we can assume, I think, that we're on the cusp of a new set of packages in the digital humanities that's going to further democratize access to machine learning for non-programming humanists over the next few years. We already have Orange, for example, which allows a sort of non-programming visual use of machine learning. Now, each of these distinct phases, I think, raise different kinds of ethical conundrums for the humanist, from questions of use, questions of sharing, openness, respect for others, privacy and inclusion, to the ethics of, for example, crowdsourcing, managing and working with controversial or situated knowledges, and even with the issue of absences and the decolonization of archives and digital humanities more generally. Digital humanities, as they begin to experiment with algorithms and draw on these kind of new artificial intelligence tools, have, for example, worked particularly with topic modeling software. If you're not familiar with topic modeling, it's really the automation of the production of thematic elements in relation to underlying data. This has sometimes been termed distant reading, where you essentially allow the computer to generate various thematic or coding qualities from an underlying piece of data. And the idea really is that you don't necessarily have to tell the computer what to do. What you can do is instruct the system to run through your data set, and the system essentially extracts an algorithm that's suitable for the task at hand. And I think you can already see in this description that you're starting to have this distantiation of the responsibility for the kinds of classifications and methods of analysis that are sort of starting to be used. And therefore, obviously, the underlying question of the norms and biases that might be in this software that you're using. So, for example, a humanist might show an image to a machine learning system to teach it to generate a text description in order to standardize the descriptive text associated in a database of images. This adds another layer of complexity to the use of these digital tools when one utilizes a machine learning system. And of course, there remains a strong possibility that the source code will not be legible, will not be available, and you have to rely on the, as it were, goodwill of the proprietary owners of the software that you are implementing. And you can see already that, you know, the automating processes that we are increasingly relying on cover over ethical issues by transferring them essentially to the algorithms and to the code of the underlying system. And it's very easy to make assumptions about the truth quality of the computer rather than necessarily interrogate it. Now, machine learning has the power to automate larger parts of the humanities, replacing research work that was previously thought to be the preserve of the human researcher, such as conceptual analysis and various sorts of framework analysis. And so whilst the humanists might, in principle, particularly with something like Mistral or some other open source type machine learning system, it actually, from that kind of source code, it's actually very, very difficult to understand what's going on in the system. You have what is essentially a gigantic set of numbers in a table, and it's very hard, even for computer scientists themselves, to translate that into any kind of framework where you can make any kind of analysis of whether and how you might have any kind of ethical considerations about what's actually happening here. And of course, this means that, as it were, the preliminary layer upstream from the later classification learning process, which is encoded through either supervised or unsupervised processes, becomes difficult to understand. The downstream classificatory structure then becomes incredibly difficult for the researcher to sort of cognitively map or check. We're in this sort of problematic of the parameters used in the classificatory processing increasing, and as it does, the complexity of the tables and numbers that we use correspondingly does so too. So, for example, in 2020, the OpenAI GPT system, GPT-3, was described as having over 175 billion machine learning parameters, and the text it classifies, the tables it produces, are consequently impossible to hold in a single humanist's head, even a computer scientist's head. Now, as the capacity of these systems to automatically classify even large data sets, we see the use of these computational systems to abstract, simplify, and visualize this complex data, the new kinds of methodological approach, the ability to throw data into the system and see what sticks, the ability to compare and contrast different kinds of data in a very kind of instrumental way, obviously also raises these kinds of very important problematics of instrumentalizing the data. And, you know, if we're going to have some sense of the importance of our care towards the data and the information it might contain, this carelessness of data can, you know, be quite problematic in relation to specific communities, for example. So this turn to what's been called distant reading raises all sorts of interesting questions, which have, of course, been discussed as kind of problematic in relation to the practices of reading in and of itself. But the ethical implications, I think, are less discussed, and consequently, I think it's urgently need to be thought about. So I see time is coming close to the end, and happily, I'm becoming close to the end of the paper too. So I just want to summarize some of the kind of key ethical issues that I think we might think about and perhaps draw out 3 key areas where we might identify kind of key developmental requirements for a kind of deontological code for digital humanities more generally. And these are actually summarized at the end of the paper as well, if you have access to it. So the first is kind of ethical issues in specific fields of research and in close relation to the objects of study. And here I'm thinking of, for example, personal data, attribution, publishing historical web data, particularly those that have wider public consequences for individuals and for groups more generally. Secondly, ethical aspects of digital humanities as a profession, both in terms of members of the digital humanities community and externally for society or individuals outside this community. So, for example, the kind of classic professional ethics requirements of do not fabricate, do not falsify, do not plagiarize, honor the work of others, give credit, and so on and so forth. So those also, I think, would be important things to think about. And thirdly, the responsibility of an individual scholar as well as of the scholarly community at large within digital humanities to the wider society, kind of public humanities concern, if you like. So, for example, the issues of creating risk for future generations through the use of technologies, questions of sustainability and environmental impacts of the kind of work that we're doing in the digital humanities, particularly in relation to, the use of LLMs and their very large amounts of energy, both to produce the original models, but also, of course, in their running, and commitment generally to kind of equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm just about finished. And so, it's very interesting, I think, that digital humanities is a kind of latecomer to the kind of more detailed and sophisticated considerations of questions over ethics. I think that relying on virtue ethics is no longer going to be kind of excusable, really, because of the difficulty of really formalizing virtue ethics in the kind of growing professional aspects of the digital humanities more generally. And also there's a kind of, I think, a big problem with essentially a kind of individualizing of ethical concerns so that it just becomes an individual matter. It seems to me highly problematic. And so clearly the digital humanities community needs to come together to think about these questions. So, I'll just finish that I do think the time is right for the digital humanities to begin to develop such a set of ethics to build, I think, a strong foundation for future research, and also to encourage a kind of wider discussion and awareness of the importance of these issues around ethics in the digital humanities community. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. Yeah, so I will not use directly my privilege as a convener, but if there are any questions from the room, they are already very welcome, be it by the chat or if you can switch on your microphone. And do not hesitate to use the little raise your hand option on Zoom. So, if there are no questions, I will kickstart the discussion, like on maybe if you can share a bit your own experience from being like active in the organization of a digital humanities department. This idea of starting to develop a charter which would not be based only on like virtue ethics. Is it something that you have tried to kickstart in your own institution, or is it something like what would be the hurdles or the barriers to this endeavor, to this initiative? Like what would be, according to you, the way to better the discussion we can have together on building a common charter?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a, from the experiences I've had in setting up an organized research unit around digital humanities, I mean, that alone generates a lot of ethical conundrums, and there isn't really many places one can go to sort of, particularly within digital humanities, for thinking about some of these issues. But just to use that as an example, in the first case, questions, for example, of soft funding of an organized research unit raises all sorts of ethical conundrums which are very rarely really thought about in relation to the generation of these centres. So, you know, many universities will throw large sums of money to get these structures going, but not sustainable funding. So you may well be in a situation where the initial group of researchers associated with a centre or a lab could be assigned 5-year contracts with no clear guidance as to what's going to happen after the 5 years. And in fact, often there's the assumption that somehow magic money will appear, whether that be by soft money funding, which is very unsustainable and exhausting. So you're trying to do work, but you also have to bring money into a research centre, which is a lot of pressure. Secondly, in these organizations, you know, traditionally in academic organization, it's a non-hierarchical collegial structure. That's not to say there's no hierarchy, of course, but the idea is that there is an equality amongst equals in terms of academic knowledges and sharing of academic knowledges. The problem with the research centres and labs is often they tend towards hierarchical management because of the nature of the technical work that's being done. They also often engender kind of hierarchical relations between technical staff and administrative staff and academic staff, which can be problematic. And they also have a tendency of actually hollowing out departments' research work. So the digital humanities work is always done over there. And of course, that itself can cause problems. So if you are an individual scholar working in the digital humanities, you're not going to be encouraged to do that work unless you are somehow directing it through the research centre. And then you fall into that kind of soft money. You have to justify this funding and so on and so forth, kind of problematic. So these kind of more general issues, which are related to the kind of ethics of organisation and management, I guess. But in terms of projects themselves, you know, because of the lack of a kind of clear set of guidance, you know, the reliance on, for example, humans to work with you on a project. I'm thinking particularly here of crowdsourcing projects, where crowdsourcing is really not thought through very carefully. It's considered a kind of like fungible resource that you can just, you know, rely on people's labor unproblematically without any recompense, and that you're essentially appropriating their knowledge and expertise, let's say. And then, of course, academia is all about publication and scholarship. When one publishes one's article, relying on this incredible crowdsourced project, you know, it's the single professor who takes all the credit for what is essentially a highly collaborative situation. Now, that's, of course, one of the problems of, you know, the general way in which we assign credit. But you know, if you have, say, 1,000 contributors to a project, it's very difficult to think about how you might want to credit all of these different contributors. But really, we don't have any mechanism to do that. And in fact, it's very hard even to surface that as a kind of problematic. And lastly, just in terms of ethics, which I think is very pertinent today, is universities are not very happy with the use of open source software, which they increasingly think of as insecure in some sense. And so we are forced increasingly to rely on proprietary software tools to do the kind of work we do. And of course, proprietary software, we do not know what's happening inside that software. They're black boxes. And we may be making certain kinds of ethical commitments or ethical moves unproblematically because the software hides it from us. The way in which we rely on these obscure black boxes to, for example, secure data, perform functions on data and calculations, and we may not know quite how those calculations are being done. So, for example, if you're doing some kind of analysis, statistical analysis on archives, on people's, you know, lives, etc. And just to say, humanists often don't have the strongest grasp of statistics, but these can be magnified when you just rely unproblematically on functions given by software. So you can see there are so many different levels at which ethical considerations come into the kinds of digital humanities projects that are being developed. And as they become increasingly larger in scale, these are only magnified and pushing it away and not considering them, of course, is a major issue.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. If there are no further clarificatory questions, I think on this matter of the stakes of sharing AI models from one research project to another, and on also the fact that the research organization implies that we have to use proprietary software instead of open source software. I think it's a good transition to the kind of solution that JADA is helping to develop with platforms such as Hugging Face, which is a way to bridge the two worlds of developing better software in an open manner. And she will probably better talk about it than me. But yeah, Jada is so a PhD candidate. I think you're gonna present yourself, so I will not present you too much. But you're a PhD candidate, I think, soon to defend, very soon to defend. And you're also one of the principal ethicists as Hugging Face on the French branch of the company. And you're one of the brilliant women in AI ethics, and I totally second this opinion. And now you will present your co-authored paper entitled "Stronger Together," a very fitting title after what David said.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Lily, for the presentation too. It was super interesting. I had a couple of questions, but maybe we can talk about them later. And quite surprising about the policy about open source, but maybe we can discuss about this later on. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so indeed, I have maybe a couple of slides about myself, because I know that when people hear that I'm an ethicist, an AI ethicist, it's kind of a new job. So I thought it might be useful to clearly explain what I do daily. So indeed, I am a PhD candidate. I am going to defend my thesis actually in 3 weeks, so wish me luck. I am at Sorbonne University doing philosophy. I'm also affiliated to the mixed unit laboratory called the Sciences, Normes, Démocratie. And so my thesis is between theory and applications of ethical challenges of conversational AI. So it means that I mainly based my research on everything that was related to conversational agents, LLMs, and everything related way before it was cool, I would say, and when they weren't really working. So it was like a huge gap between when I started and nowadays. At the same time, I'm the full-time principal ethicist at Hugging Face. It means that I'm the only one with a philosophy background working there, basically. I am the member of a team called the Machine Learning and Society team. So our manager is actually a computer scientist, and then we have other members of the team working, for instance, on climate change issues, or internal policy, external policy, like our head of global policy, and other specific questions. But altogether, we basically do interdisciplinary research in AI ethics. I mean, of course, that's my main focus, and my other colleagues have different expertise. So it means that daily, especially in the business context, I would say, I deal with regulations, standardizations, like agencies, ethics, of course, like in theory and practice, internal and external policy, computer science, etc., etc. And then since the very beginning, I was also in charge, and I'm still in charge of the platform content moderation and policy. So as you can imagine, moderating machine learning content, it's not the same as, for instance, moderating content on GitHub. So we have new challenges every day, and it's really stimulating, and especially knowing that they put in charge a philosopher, you can imagine that we have a really long and in-depth conversations about everything we do. And so maybe super briefly, what's Hugging Face? Because maybe that's not clear to everyone. So it's a collaborative open source platform where you can find any AI tool available open source. So coming from both the community, so plain users like yourself or myself, or even bigger or smaller organizations. So it means that we host models, so open models of any task. So it can be language models, as we talked about it, or it can also be text to image. So they're basically called multimodal models, meaning that you have two different natures of data that it's shared. And other kind of models. So of course, it could also be computer vision and blah, blah, blah. We also host datasets, so that's our second vertical, I would say. And then really complete applications, AI applications that we call spaces. So if you want to set up your own AI application, it means that you can do so from scratch directly on what it's called the hub. So it's the Hugging Face hub. Voila. So up. What do I do at Hugging Face, as I was saying? So of course, I'm a researcher, basically a researcher. So it means that most of my time I'm doing research. Maybe if we have time, I'd be happy to share what's my main research project nowadays. So I'm specialized actually in ethical charters and frameworks. So I drafted the ethical charter for the diffusers library. I don't know if you are familiar with the diffuser or diffusion models, like for instance, stable diffusion. It comes from there, and it's an open source library. So it means that we also have an ethical charter for there. I might explain why maybe later on. Big Science, which I'm going to present today at the very end of this presentation as a practical example. I also deal with policy, law regulation, I also was saying. So especially since I'm based in Paris, I do that especially like in the European context, Brussels. And I also do internal and external collaborations on specific projects. So of course, mostly related to open source, safe releases. As I was saying, like Stable Diffusion, I was also involved with their release on our platform. So Stable Diffusion, the text-to-image model. Maybe you're familiar with Midjourney. It's kind of the same thing. And as I was saying, I also deal with content moderation. So I drafted the content policy that it's now online. And as I was saying, there are new challenges. Maybe we can explore that after. And then cross-team collaboration. So means that on specific projects, I can collaborate with engineers and developers. So all that to say really quickly, I hope it didn't take too much time, that all my days are different. Like I can spend a lot of time and maybe some time, especially for one specific deployment, and then focusing on another issue. But every day is a different day, and that's the beauty maybe of working for a platform. Anyhow, the core, I would say, topic of today was, as Éric was saying, to present you the paper that I co-authored last year for FACT, that got accepted to FACT, and I presented it to when I was in Chicago. And it's called Stronger Together on the Articulation of Ethical Charters, User Licenses, and Technical Documentation. That's the whole title. And it's done with my colleague Carlos Muñoz Ferrandis, Yasin Yanit, and Margaret Mitchell, that maybe you heard of. So it's basically a proposal of an analysis framework for AI governance. So of course, there's a big focus on AI ethics too, but the main, I would say, goal of the paper is really to suggest, both in theory and in practice, what kind of an analysis framework could look like if we had philosophy, law, and computer science working together, with a strong focus on the role of values. So I think it makes actually a good link with the previous presentation. So it's, to go into more details, maybe it's the study, and as I was saying, more specifically on their tools of ethical charters, the user licenses, and technical documentation when we want to develop and deploy AI systems. So we start by saying that, of course, there are several tools that already exist in different disciplines. since I like to think that artificial intelligence, one of the most interesting thing from it is that it's a really transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary different discipline. So that it bridges like a lot of different fields. And so if we take ethical frameworks, licenses and regulation, and technical documentation such as model and data cards that I'll explain more in detail later on, we can make and we can see there are really nice articulations that could be made, especially once again in the context of AI development and deployment. So those interesting interactions, they exist between philosophy and so in specifically ethics, law and computer science. What does it mean? Then I would say it's important to start by giving definitions. And so that's maybe because I'm trained as a philosopher and we do love defining things. Why did I start by giving those three definitions? It's because I don't know how many times I heard that, oh, my AI system is GDPR compliant in the EU, so it means that it's ethical. And that's not exactly the same thing. They might be complementary, but it doesn't mean if your tool is legally compliant, that it's ethically compliant and vice versa. So I think it was important to kind of make it clear at the beginning. So for instance, when we talk, especially in this context, when we talk about ethical compliance, it involves so the articulation of principles, or it could be values that are usually enshrined in an ethical charter, but it could be any kind of, I would say, a code of ethics document. And so this specific articulation, it catalyzes direct moral responsibility, so which is of course different from legal responsibility on the part of the people, of course, that sign that specific framework. Then, of course, we have legal compliance, which involves ensuring that in this specific case, AI systems complied with relevant laws and regulations, of course. If we want to give an example, it involves a social articulation between business and authorities, for instance, or the civil society, etc., etc. When we go to technical compliance, it might seem trivial, but I think, and I'm convinced that especially in the AI context, it's even more important, and that's why it has its own place in those three different notions of compliance. It's because it involves ensuring that AI systems meet technical standards, like we know, for instance, ISO, or there are even national standards that exist and international ones, and specifications, of course. And in that specific case, it ensures the AI systems in our context are reliable, safe, and explainable. So if we take a step back, and I was saying that especially this paper has a really big focus on the role of values. I would say once again that it's important to define them. So in the social sciences and humanities, we have a lot of different definitions. And so, for instance, and they're not always super clear. So, and even so, I would say, especially while talking with engineers or mathematicians, of course, a value, it's not at all the same as for us. Or I'm guessing when we talk about bias in ethics or social, like digital humanities or social science, of course, it's not the same as for a mathematician or a statistics, basically. So even in this context, as I was saying, if we try to take a look at what do values mean. So in social psychology, human values are defined as human behaviors between our choices and preferences. In sociology, is the investigation into values. It means that they focus on the distinction between value judgments and value relationships. Of course, that's how really put everything in the box. I know it's way broader than that, but in the sake of time. And in ethics, of course, it's the most difficult one because it's really hard to find a common definition and, of course, also consensus of which everyone agrees upon. But we're going to try today together because in that specific paper, We took a pragmatic approach. So pragmatism in ethics, so it comes from John Dewey, and specifically in his work called Valuation Theory from 1939. And so once again, really roughly and briefly, when he talks about values, he talks about what we humans, we do value. So what's also interesting in this pragmatic approach is that those same values have political significance. And so it means that they must be considered as cultural and therefore analyzed in their social and cultural context. So it means that they can't be detached from their social and cultural and political context. So also according to Dewey, values are also the result of individual experience, and so their formation is directly influenced by desires, interests, and social customs. So if we try to look at natural values, we also briefly said it before, in value theory, there's usually also the distinction of intrinsic and extrinsic. So when we talk about intrinsic values, really briefly, we mean that those same values are valid in themselves as an end. And when we talk about extrinsic, it means that are characterized as a means to an end. Like, to give you a concrete example, so the value of transparency, which is really easy to find in a lot of ethical frameworks or ethical charters when it comes to AI. It needs to be analyzed as an extrinsic value. Why? Because asserting that an AI system is transparent, it does not guarantee a positive moral evaluation. So it doesn't mean, for instance, that, I don't know, if Facebook is clearly and in a transparent way stating that it's collecting all your personal data, it is indeed transparent, but it doesn't mean that we can give a moral judgment as being good. So transparency in that specific case would have to be linked to an intrinsic value, such as, for instance, responsibility, for it to make sense to consider it as having a positive value. So if we try to go from ethics to law, of course, also here taking a statement. So in the literature of philosophy of law, according to Roland Dworkin, ethics plays a vital role in the formation and nature of law. So it means that it usually comes first and then law comes after, and has also the power to influence the interpretation and the application of law. Basically, how judges are going to interpret the law based on their own societal values, for instance. And so law in that case becomes a system of principles that reflects the values and all the beliefs of a specific society, rather than simply a set of rules issued by an institution. So it would be basically bottom up instead of being top down. So also according to Dworkin, it is organic by nature and constantly adapting and evolving in response to new social situations. So it's, and that it's also something really also discussed in value theory in general, but it's not because nowadays we agree upon some values or we describe them as being as they are today. It doesn't mean that they're going to be the same in 5, 10 years, 15 years. Of course, the beauty of them, I would say, is that they evolve with society itself. And so according to Dworkin, they also apply to law in that sense. So why I'm telling you all that theory, because if we take the example of the AI Act, for instance, we can also see, so we saw basically how ethics becomes law, and then now I would say, how does law become regulation, or how does law becomes basically technical compliance, as I was saying in the beginning. So maybe briefly, because I don't think I have a specific slide for it. What are model cards? They have been studied since 2016, roughly, I would say. from one of my co-authors, actually Margaret Mitchell. It was in the context of when she was working at Google. But there is extensive documentation that goes with any deployment or big deployment of big and important AI systems. So they are called in a lot of different ways. Like, if I'm not mistaken, OpenAI calls them system cards, or I don't know how many other wordings exist, but they roughly mean the same thing. And why they're important? They're important because they're going to tell you how you can use that specific system, what's the targeted user, and what kind of user is supposed to use that specific system, what's the intended use case, but also what's the unintended use case. And so it can be something pretty easy, such as when you're using these, I don't know, image detector, you should have a lot of light on you in order to make the system make it recognize your face. Or it could also be when using the specific NLM, please do not give away medical advice. So that can go from there to there. And then, of course, there's also carbon footprint, impact, etc., etc. So when I say excessive documentation, it's really extensive. And so why I'm talking about this is because, as I was saying, we saw from ethics to law how it goes, and now from law to basically technical compliance. One example I wanted to give you, it's indeed in the AI Act. So the EU's latest AI bill that maybe you are familiar with also refers to model cards as a source of documentation. And so we can kind of see that there's an alignment between regulatory then mandates and the data that the AI community anticipates providing, because of course, as I was saying, it's something that has been researched by since 2016, but it's really adopted not only by big tech companies, but also from our users. And so there's here the possibility for model cards to evolve into the go-to instrument for meeting future legal and regulatory requirements. So it started from being extensive documentation, and now it could also become, maybe, who knows, in 5-10 years, the go-to maybe standard for AI deployment, and especially and also development. So if we try to sum up what we saw for now, so I'd say that we can roughly say that the role of ethics, law, and computer science could be also maybe summarized by 3 specific questions. And so I would say that maybe ethics asks how ought this technology be used, while the legal aspect, it's going to ask how shall this technology be used, and then the technical would say how can this technology be used. So as we can see, the 3 complementary, but they also need each other. So complementary in the sense that they also need each other. If we try to also summarize this whole articulation, so also in theory, I think this is my most dense maybe slide, so bear with me. In our articulation, in our analysis framework, we can see the 3 different roles also having 3 different aspects. And so we can summarize them as being normative, prescriptive, and descriptive. And once again, I usually like to think that ethics, I have this image where ethics is kind of the roots of a big tree. And then from that specific tree, we can have different branches. But that specific tree would be the normative aspect. And so today we call them ethical charters, but it could be anything tomorrow, of course. Like today we're talking about one specific ethical tool, but it can become any other instrument coming from ethics literature. And so why normative? Because it expresses the values drafted in an ethical chart in our case. So also defining the priorities, and as we were saying, what we value in a specific project or in a development or in deployment of an AI system. And so the normative component influences both the prescriptive and descriptive aspects. How? Like in our case, we have, you can see with the arrows, so technical documentation on a side, which is going to be descriptive, because of course it's just going to describe what does the system do and how it can be used, what kind of GPU you need, etc. But also on the other side, we have machine learning licensing. So we talked about open source, but of course that's not the only one. As also David was saying, we also have proprietary systems. And basically I would say, most important tool that we can have nowadays for AI regulations is at least that's in the main hands and the power of users. It's also the user license, and that would be the prescriptive aspect of our articulation. Why? Because it pertains to what uses an ML artifact should be allowed or prohibited, of course. And in our case, it's based on the values that are expressed in the ethical charter. And then once again, the descriptive, as I was saying, the technical documentation, because it reports the capabilities and the possible failures, which is also super important, of course. It includes an extensive documentation, as I've been saying, which informs what potential harms and rights violation need to be addressed in licenses and regulation. So that's in theory. I know that maybe it's too much theory, so I think it's important to, if I still have time, briefly to explain how we got there and how does it translate in practice. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Big Science workshop, but it was a workshop where we were over 1,000 researchers coming from all kind of different types of disciplines. And we developed and deployed, so in open access, Bloom, which is the biggest multilingual large language model that exists today, which has been trained not far from here in Paris, and Roots, which is its text corpora. And we released everything in open access. And also the goal was, of course, also from people not coming from computer science, being able to study those artifacts, those systems, and kind of trying to understand what was going on. So as you can imagine, there was a really wide range of different disciplines interacting with each other. So going back to our analysis framework, how the three notions, for instance, of compliance that I presented to you interacted in this case. So through a consensus-based process, all the big science collaborators described and outlined the project's intrinsic values. So we drafted an ethical charter, and those same values inform the development of it's called RAIL because it means Responsible AI License, especially its appendix, which is called use restrictions. And as you can imagine, it's everything you can't do basically with our artifacts. And the Bloom's model card, which was the famous extensive documentation I was telling you about. So some examples of the values that we picked. There was, of course, as you can imagine, since it was an open science project, reproducibility was one of the main values that we picked. And it has to be described in the ethical charter. Then it has to be, and also maybe important point, I'm sure everybody knows it, but I think it's important to remind that a value, or it's a value only if we can express it through actions, because otherwise it's just what's so-called, I think David mentioned Luciano Floridi, and he has a paper about it, what it calls ethics shopping, where we basically go here and there and we pick all the values that we think that are pretty, that could be nice to put in an ethical charter, but values are important if they're expressed through actions, because otherwise they can be called values. And so the examples that I'm giving you today, such as reproducibility, as I was saying, has been described in the ethical charter, and then has been expressed, so through the action of expressing it through an open license, because the Responsible AI license makes the multilingual large language model and its data set open access, so accessible, so reproducible, of course, and it also be operationalized by the technical documentation, because I can also invite you to take a look. Everything is available on the internet. But the Bloom's model card, it's so extensive that I think it makes 15-20 pages where you can say like what's the hardware that you need, what kind of like what was the carbon footprint of the development and the deployment of that specific multilingual large language model, which is Bloom. There's a really lot of information. And so, of course, the goal, as I was saying, is for it to be reproducible by other scientists. Another important value, as you can imagine, was multilingualism. And so it was a value because it laid the foundation of what we wanted to achieve. I think we mentioned GPT-3. As you can imagine, like the project it started in 2021, and one of the main goals was for us to make something similar to GPT-3, but completely open. And we wanted to prove that it was possible to make those really big and huge systems in the open, like available for everyone to join. I wasn't part of Hacking Face at the time, and I was able to join as a volunteer, as a basic researcher. And then also it was possible to make it multilingual, because as we know from today, GPT-3 was trained on over 93% of data that came from English. And so we wanted to prove that it was possible to make it multilingual. So when I say that Bloom is multilingual, I think it has over 46 different languages. So the value of multilingualism, it was laying the foundation, as I was saying, of the project, and it was also a technical feature in order to make it happen. It means that we had a really throughout a process of data governance where we asked people who were native speakers to help us create all together the famous data set, which is now called Roots and has been used to train Bloom. So I also see that we're almost at time. I would say to maybe end it here that, of course, I'm convinced that all interdisciplinary AI fields need to work jointly on developing practical tools, but also methods for integrating ethical, legal, and technical compliance, and maybe more, into AI development processes, but also deployment. That I hope I showed you today that ethics and values really play a vital role when considering AI governance more in general, and interdisciplinary research also more broadly, because I really believe that it can be the bridge for all of us to discuss this kind of issue. It can be in AI, but also in other contexts. And then, of course, that ethical, legal, and technical compliance can be considered in isolation in this context and in other ones, but they are truly stronger together, as our title says. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Giada, for this really, really good presentation, and I think really thought-provoking as the previous one. So are there any people in the room willing to ask some questions? Clarificatory questions for Giada maybe first, and if there is no clarificatory question, we can go directly into the discussion. So Daniel, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I don't know if this is a clarification question though, so it's more of a discussion.
Well, it looks like you're the only one, so you
Okay.
can go, I guess.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations immensely. So I'm also in interdisciplinary research. I work at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, but from a very interdisciplinary perspective on AI ethics. I'm super curious to hear your thoughts on because with Hugging Face, it's open source, and one of the concerns that I have, because I completely agree that there needs to be an interdisciplinary approach to, and also full life cycle approach to incorporating values and ethics into these systems. And I think you can only do that through these interdisciplinary conversations. But one of the things I'm a little bit worried about right now, or I'm trying to address it with my own research, is when we have these open source systems, there's a large potential for intentional misuse, which bypass a lot of these ethical considerations that well-intentioned users or developers might have when they are building the systems. So I mean, do you think you could go into that a little bit? I would appreciate it.
I was guessing that maybe it was a question for me, but I open up for to leave the floor afterwards. So of course, I think it's one of the biggest. You're asking one of the biggest questions because so of course, maybe I'm biased because I do work for an open source company, but as I was saying, I also deal with content moderation. So this is one of the biggest questions, basically, because it's something that could also be interesting to analyze and study is, for instance, if I want to, I don't know, make an open source model for, I don't know, helping social media with toxic language or with moderation, it means that I do need to train the specific model on toxic language. And if it's open source, of course, I can misuse it. So it can be either I want to use it in a good way and then I get back like malicious output, or I can be malicious myself and then use it in a bad way. So I think it's important to also give the famous intended uses and unintended uses. And I think my presentation wanted to also give maybe suggestions on how to do so, because I do not believe that open source means with no rules and everybody can do whatever they want. But I do believe there are really great advantages. And like, for instance, the question of transparency, as also David was saying, when you have proprietary software, so you don't really know what's trained on, you don't really have control on what's going in, what's going out. So I do think that it's a balance between the two of them, between closed and open. But I do think that it's even more important, especially nowadays, because we're still trying to figure out how do those systems work, to be able to scrutinize them and to analyze and to stay them in the open as much as possible, because I don't think that open source in general means more dangerous. Because if we think about it, even encryption technology, it's an open source technology, and all our computers are running on Linux core, which is also open source. So I do think that it's important to shift the responsibility to the humans involved and are all around those systems, because even when we do talk about automation or autonomous AI systems, there are still humans that are pushing buttons and doing things. So I do think that with a nice framework, especially consider DI governance, it doesn't have to be my framework, but it could be any framework. I think it's important to have those discussions, but I do still believe that in this famous balance, open source wins in that case. So at least those are my two cents. And maybe to give you one small example, and then I'll shut up. On the Hugging Face Hub, we do have different features. For instance, we have staged release. It means that the specific example that I gave you about toxic language detection, for instance, if you clearly state that it's for research, then you can have it open source, but with behind a gated access. It means that the authors of the repository needs to get your own information, such as name, last name, emails, and all contact information to track down basically what you're doing with that model. So that's why I don't think it's white or black. I think there are nuances, and we can put in place features and a whole ecosystem where we can use responsible open source systems.
Yeah, great answer. David, do you have something to add to that? I would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think I kind of broadly agree. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is the implication that open source. We've got ourselves into a situation where we think in terms of a kind of polarity between open source and proprietary software. And of course, you know, there are also ethical values associated with open source in and of itself, which we really should take into account and sort of complexify the kind of conversation, because, you know, open source was defined against free software, for example, which had a much more communitarian set of values, community developed values, as opposed to the the use of open source was essentially a kind of individualistic neoliberal term, which we often forget because we kind of casting around for some kind of response to this kind of problematic of ethical uses of AI, for example. I think there are lots of very interesting kind of discussions for us to have as time goes on in thinking and kind of complexifying those kind of questions. Do you mind if I ask a question, actually, Eric? Or to have the
No,
floor?
go on. I was gonna ask one, but go on yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, if you could talk us through really your thinking that led you to the use of Dewey actually as the basis of your ethical framework, because it is kind of idiosyncratic actually, and interestingly idiosyncratic, and particularly I just wondered about the kind of presuppositions that are embedded in a kind of pragmatic notion of ethics, particularly kind of the instrumental critiques of pragmatism more generally. I wonder if you could sort of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So, as you also were saying, I know that especially in AI ethics nowadays, you mainly have two, I would say, more broadly approaches that are used, such as wish-to ethics, because we see that a lot, and utilitarianism. And to be completely honest, when I started drafting the ethical charter for big science, I was really fond of Confucian ethics. And I'd say that I know that maybe that's also the beauty of ethics or normative ethics in general, is that especially when it comes to AI, we have already lots of literature with, I don't know, maybe the ethics of engineering, the ethics of computers, the ethics of the internet, social media, etc. But I do believe that it's a whole new, when studying artificial intelligence, there are so many questions. Like you raised a few, but that could be infinite. And I'm specifically interested in usage. And so maybe also because I did a lot of user research in the previous company when I was working in a chatbot company. And so I also have a background in political philosophy and in political science. So I'd say that maybe that's what drove me first in those kind of approaches. But I do think it worked well, to be honest, with the philosophy of law approach that I also used coming from Dworkin, because I know that it can also be seen in opposition. I'm well aware of all the critics of pragmatism, and I don't think it's the answer to everything, especially when we talk about values. One could say, and I think it's a really good critique, that if we want to take all society values and those same values could be considered as being wrong, like let's say, well, all Nazi, for instance, does it mean that we do have to put those same values in an ethical charter? So I think those are really good critiques, but I really thought that it worked well in the context of trying to bridge different disciplines. Maybe it could be better done. Maybe we could be, I don't know, maybe we could dive in different approaches as well. And I do believe that, I mean, at least I'm sure that maybe in a couple of years, they're going to be like, for instance, another approach that I really like, you also mentioning, is care ethics, especially in the context of AI, and also relational ethics. So I'm really curious I don't do normative ethics, so I mainly pick what other people do, but I'm really curious to see how really the field is going to evolve, because I'm sure it's going to be really enriching. And I'm specifically excited about non-Western approaches. So that's why, for instance, for big science, I was really interested in Confucian ethics. And so, yeah, maybe I don't have a clear-cut answer. I'm well aware of the critiques, but I did think that it worked well, specifically in a context where I really needed to link basically law, computer science, and all different disciplines. And I thought it worked well, but yeah. So I would say that's one of the answer.
That's really interesting. Just if I may, just one more quick question. It's really one thing that really struck me was the question where these ethical values that you're identifying are coming from, which you didn't speak to, and that raises kind of questions. I thought in terms of there's a kind of elite aspect to the identification of the kind of ethical the ethical norms, the ethic values that you identify, and could one democratize them? I was just wondering about that. And secondly, how do you reconcile the interpretative flexibility of these terms that you're using? Because you unproblematically put up responsibility, but of course, responsibility is not an unproblematic term in any sense, and has multiple values.
Yeah, so in order, I would say that that's actually a good question, because like, where did we pick basically all those values? So I did a whole presentation about what I called this kind of moral exercise, where we were, of course, you can imagine, we were over 1,000 researchers. So it wasn't not all of the 1,000 researchers working on the ethical charter. I would say roughly maybe between 200, 300, we're really thinking through about it. And of course, it's really hard to make them get consensus about something that we were saying. So what I did is that for roughly maybe 2-3 weeks, I was going through all the different documents that already existed about the project. So we needed to ask for a grant. So as you can imagine, there was already a lot of documentation about what was the philosophy of the project, what did they want to achieve, what was important for them. And so I roughly tried to translate everything into what I thought were something interesting to discuss. Even like you mentioned responsibility, and I think I now remember if we do have responsibility like as it is, because something that was super important and was the main moral exercise was to define them in our context. And so we started debriefing. So we had weekly meetings for an hour or two, where we basically, and I would say that was really hard to do, because not only we had different points of view, but we were coming from all different disciplines, all different parts of the world, speaking different languages. So we weren't really valuing everything or seeing at least the same things in the same way. And so that to say that I roughly started by giving a first draft and then opened the discussion. And so from there, we did, and we used what's called a discussion ethics. I really based at least my practice on Habermas, and we were looking at what was at least like giving everyone the word, like what do you mean by this, by that, etc., and really looking for a consensus. And then, of course, I needed to also draw a line at some point and suggest something. So, of course, there was like a lot of my input, I would say, but it was really important for me to, especially being contextual. So, because I was super scared of having really abstract values that don't really I don't really know what they mean, and especially out of their context. So that's why actually I can also link it to you because it's online. So it was really important to set the boundaries of, like, for instance, if I read it here, I can also send it to you. It's here. What was the scope? What are the people concerned? What were the limitations of the ethical charter? What was the relevance over time? And I think that also kind of answers your question about legitimacy. So, like, who are we and why are we saying stuff about ethical charters and stuff? What was our ethical approach? What we meant by ethical compliance? What was these famous articulations that I tried to explain with other documents? And then I also divided them between intrinsic and extrinsic. And if we want to read it together under responsibility, we wrote that each contributor has both an individual and a collective responsibility for their work within the Big Science project. So this responsibility is both social and environmental. Big Science intends to positively impact stakeholders through its artifacts regarding the former. And so concerning the latter, Big Science is committed to developing tools to monitor and lower its artifacts' carbon footprint and energy consumption. That's actually something that's available also on Hugging Face platform. And moreover, other tools such as an open legal playbook for NLP researchers, guiding them regarding the use and respect of IP and privacy rights, also seek to promote responsibility around the scientific community. So we're really trying to frame it in the context of our project. What we were able to do, because of course we also had the big question of, are we writing an ethical charter for everyone who's going to use our artifacts, or it was just ourselves? So it was really important to set all those kind of boundaries.
Thank you.
Well, if I may add a question and maybe to link the two presentations on, I think it's something that yourself, Jada, wanted to ask to David on what you said about the fact that institutions globally, they tend not to push researchers towards open source software and to prefer proprietary software. And like, on the one hand, like, how could you explain that? Because like proprietary software, we can, like, intuitively, it's kind of against the norms of research, like against transparency and so on and so forth. So like, why would institutions push researchers towards something which is not in the epistemic norms of the field? And on the other side, how much do you feel that model cards could be a way to make such open source models more trustworthy for institutions to ascertain that they have no flaws on like safety aspects and so on and so forth? So like how would you react on this point? Like, do you think that model cards and what Jada presented could be kind of an argument for institutions to stop pushing ourselves towards proprietary software?
Well, I mean, it's a complex answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I guess the first answer really will be political economic, right? Costs of maintaining complex software and software teams that can implement and kind of what's the word? Ensure that the functioning of the software, troubleshoot their problems, is expensive, right? That's the first thing. Secondly, universities don't have their own electricity plants and generate their own electricity, nor do they have water purification plants. And increasingly, as we see computation as a kind of resource, I think it's a natural assumption that you have a kind of utility model of computation. And in fact, there's a very strong political economic pressure by large corporations to kind of get management to think in this way. Also, I would say that, kind of researcher training, increasingly researchers are, experiencing in their kind of training experiences, not necessarily open source software. So they will be given, let's say, for example, NVivo, a kind of closed source proprietary software in the training, because it's, the one, what we might add here at one point is that most open source software is pretty poor at managing user interface, human computer interface problems. And so if you're training with open source software, it can be a lot more difficult. So you pick up a proprietary piece of software to do that. And of course, that embeds a certain kind of expectation of how software works. Open source software is often quite difficult to install. It can be quite text-based and so on and so forth. And, many of the scholars and researchers across the university, they're often not, highly computationally literate. They signed up to become computer scientists in order to do their research. They want to do their research. And so if a tool they find does the job quicker, they're very likely to kind of pick that up and run with it. And that's very interesting in terms of, for example, my university, where, with the danger from hacking and phishing attacks and all this kind of stuff, increasingly security lockdowns are happening. What I have noticed is when open source software, oh, my lights have gone out. Hang on 1 second. When open source software security environment, I've noticed immediately that there are calls to replace it with a proprietary alternative because it's seen somehow as more secure, or better, there's someone we can identify and sue for having failed. So there are so many aspects to this kind of move, and telling academics what software to use is like herding cats sometimes. And if they're told to use a particular software package, they may well just go off and buy something random on the internet and start using that instead. So it's a complex set of factors, I think, that happen here. I mean, you know, look at the way in which Word has become the kind of hegemonic document management software, which we all hate. And yet, of course, we all use because it's become such a standard piece of software. So I think there are many factors, and it's very difficult to push back on that, actually.
And how much do you think that some aspects of what's being made visible through the model cards, I'm thinking especially, for instance, the carbon footprints, like how much do you think this can also go into the balance, into choices between different alternatives in the way that, and I think it's a question for both of you, because it's also the way that the AI system in itself is transforming our set of values and norms. Because in what you are presenting, Gerald, the entry point is kind of the ethical charter, but actually the ethical charter is in itself a reaction to the technological project that's behind it. So, and in what you presented as problems, David, in your talk, it's also the matter of how AI is making visible the gaps and lacks we have in ethical norms in digital humanities. So the question would be like how our understanding, like epistemological understanding and practical understanding of AI systems and computers as a whole in this digitization trend, how our understanding is shaping also our own moral compass. Like, do you have any kind of reaction to this, David or Jada?
Yeah, shall I pick that up first? I mean, there's a couple of things that it strikes me here. So, you know, clearly model cards are not going to be a panacea in any sense. Yeah. And there has to be a model card to identify that about the model cards, as it were. Maybe there's a kind of infinite regress there. But, you know, one thing we might think about is the kind of question as to whether these model cards become a kind of ethical product. So it's a sort of ethical washing, as it were, that, you know, the software is supplied with the model cards. If one follows those model cards, then everything's fine. And, you know, it reminds me of debates over explainability. It's very similar, actually, that, you know, the easy answer to problems of explainability sometimes is the idea of an explanatory product that is generated by the system in response to certain kinds of questioning or challenging. And really, you know, I'm not sure how you might do this, but you might wonder about whether we could somehow capture the ethical process and not just the kind of ethical product. And again, that really reminds me of just debates in explainability more generally, and that I would connect to your kind of epistemological point about, you know, how do we raise questions more generally, kind of reflexive questions, as it were, about the system and the system's understanding of itself and its own kind of classificatory and algorithmic processes. So yeah, I would definitely point to that explainability literature, which is extremely interesting at the moment.
Yeah, to continue, I agree. I do think that model cards maybe are just a part of a bigger puzzle, and they shouldn't be the go-to solution to everything. And concerning how also AI systems are shaping our values, I think, at least I believe that it's hard, and I don't really trust super general, for instance, ethical frameworks that they want to govern all kind of AI systems. I think it's important to be contextual. And so that's why the kind of process that we did with Big Science, it was interesting to me because it came before the deployment, while sometimes, unfortunately, those kind of tools and methodologies usually come afterwards, and usually after something bad happens. So instead of being proactive, you end up just being reactive and the fireman, as I usually say, of the situation. And so that doesn't any good to anyone. So one of the constraints, of course, it's time, because at least for now, we know that the general philosophy is more break things and go fast and think about consequences later. So, of course, setting up a really big governance framework, it takes time, it takes energy. And especially what really bothers me is that's really specific to general purpose AI systems, for instance, is that they're so broad, that they're so general, that usually ML engineers, they just go like, oh, but I don't really know what's the intended use, so I don't really know how to frame it, I don't really know how to control it, so that's out of my mind and out of my hands, especially. And so I also had a chat with someone from the open source community, not just related to AI. And he said to me, but if you start like making me accountable for everything I develop, then I wouldn't develop anything anymore, because it would mean that I had to think about all those possible use cases beforehand. And that's why I think it's important to have those really big interdisciplinary groups of not just study, but also applications, because I don't expect engineers to become philosophers, but I expect them to ask questions when they're deploying something. So I think everything is connected, and that's also the same for just plain users. So even if you're not in the development side, I would say it's important for the user to ask questions and also to pretend information. And in some case, saying, I'm not comfortable, I don't think that's safe, so I'm just not gonna use it. I know it's harsh, I know it's hard, and I know it's really hard to not be tempted by, I don't know, using ChatGPT if you're not comfortable. But I think it's something that we should teach, and it's something that we should educate also users to do, that there's still the option of asking for more. But unfortunately, I think we're in the chaotic creative process of AI for now, because to be completely honest, I've been studying it for a long time now, and I'm 90% sure that all use cases we list today for instance, LLMs, not all of them are useful. They mainly just make us lose time. And so I think we still need to figure out what's going to be the famous context. And I think that context is going to be really fundamental to look for.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your answer. And I think in a way it echoes the plurality of practices we have in digital humanities, and maybe why it's difficult to have like a precise ethical framework in the discipline, because as you said, David, it's not a unified practice with only one methodology that we would apply to only one kind of topic or object. So I think we have kind of the same difficulty both in AI and in digital humanities of framing what is foundational, to use the term as in AI, like what is the foundation model of our ethics and how can we branch it into the different contexts. So yeah, I think we have some links here, and maybe the fact to think about AI in digital humanities is also a way to think about this plurality of digital humanities. So,
Yeah,
are there any other?
can I come back on that, Eric? Just want to say, you know,
Yes.
that's I think quite an interesting point. Although, you know, the plurality is also in sociology, the plurality is also there in digital media research, and they have managed to create some very good, I think, ethical guidelines. So there is space there. I mean, even if we had digital humanities, an ethical guideline to consider ethical considerations, that would be a good start.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's already one lead on which we can try to go. Are there any other people in the room still having questions? Or David or Jada, do you have questions for each other?
Maybe I had a last question for David, just maybe a really practical one. If you could give maybe the one example that excites you the most about AI in the digital humanities, or like a use case that really interests you, not specifically related with maybe ethical issues, but still like, because to give you an example, I was in these other AI in the humanities conference where there was two French philologists who showed us how they use generative AI to regenerate really medieval and ancient texts, and I thought it was super interesting. So I was just wondering if what excites you the most of the use of AI in your discipline.
Gosh, that is a very difficult question to answer. So incidentally, the generative use of AI to fill in blanks in historical scripts and carvings is really, really incredible. Some work being done that's quite dramatic, but of course the hallucination considerations are very, very important there for that area. I just really wanted to kind of mention a couple that come to mind immediately, and that's one of them is just the kind of power of what Stephen Ramsey has called the hermeneutics of playing around, which is really you know, throwing things in and just seeing what you can find in documents. So thematic analysis, like on-the-go thematic analysis, is very, very interesting. I use it in my teaching actually because it's so much easier to sort of explain how thematics can be generated by text by using ChatGPT than any other text-based program, and actually kind of more fun as well. So, you know, if you compare it to sort of the kind of word counting sort of softwares that you can use, they're quite sort of dry, whereas ChatGPT can be very fun for students to experience that kind of thematic. And also, I really think it's very interesting, and it's kind of a question for the development of methodologies, the kind of chain of reasoning way of working through research approaches on these LLMs. Not yet formalized, but I do think there's a lot of potential there. One other thing I just wanted to highlight, which I also use with my students, which I think is a really possibly productive approach, is I don't know if you've heard of the software ChatPDF. But ChatPDF is essentially a drag and drop system where you drag in and drop your academic paper that you're working with, and then you can have a conversation with the academic paper about what it's about. It's kind of like a Latourian object. It will tell you what it is about and what its you know, its contents are and how it thinks about things and so on and so forth. And again, that can be extremely kind of exciting in terms of a kind of explorative method for working with materials. But I think what I would say my the thing that gets me most excited about the possibilities for LLMs is actually the unintended consequences of actual kind of classificatory systems that produce results that are just unexpected. So one that is quite wonderful is a project on the early books materials where the software was trained, an LLM was trained to essentially classify woodcuts. And the woodcuts were difficult because you would have, for example, the famous one that is a picture of a woman holding a fan, and human classifiers would often say, oh, it's a woman with a fan, or it's a woman with an asparagus, it's a woman with a piece of spinach leaf, it's a woman with a palm, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's a kind of big problematic when you're trying to search these databases and work with them. So the LLMs were quite exciting in standardizing the textual complement to the images. However, a side effect of this software was it was, unbeknownst to the researchers, the humanists, it was also actually classifying the typographic font that was used in the materials. And so subsequently, it started finding matches between different medieval documents across Europe. And suddenly you could trace the movement of type as it was bought and sold across Europe. So this was a kind of emergent research outcome, which had not been expected at all by the original investigators. So these kinds of knock-on effects and the kind of challenges to the way we assume our research will go, I think, are absolutely quite incredible.
Yeah, thanks a lot for these insights, David. And on the point of hallucination, it makes me think that also we could maybe at some point have a feedback from digital humanities to especially LLMs, because the techniques we know from digital humanities could be used to study the corpora generated by tools as GPT and so on and so forth, like trying to produce some kind of explainability of the systems we do not fully understand. And maybe it's also a way to close the loop by keeping the human in the middle of it, I would say. But yeah, on this, except if there are no further questions or remarks, I think it was really a wonderful session. The last one of the term. So the Channels of Digital Scholarship will reconvene on the 9th of May for a session on AI and photography. And I just want to thank both of you again, David and Jada, for these two marvelous presentations and the really interesting discussions I think we had afterwards. And thanks to everyone that was present in the room, in the virtual room. Well, have a good night and thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.